on that in the chat. You can also go to RSA for a lot more. So here I have the definitive story on the RSA. This is a copy of Anton's book, Arts and Minds. This is not a dry historical tome. It is a very interesting read about a 250-year-old member-driven nonprofit organization, featuring some very interesting characters and surprising stories. I was surprised to hear the story of how Henry Cole, one of the leaders of the RSA, at one point pulled together interests in art, commerce, politics, and utilitarian principles to invent the flat rate postage stamp, an incredibly important innovation at the time and something we're still benefiting from today. Now, as I've gotten to know more about the RSA, I've been very impressed with its multidisciplinary approach and its focus on changing the institutions and the disincentives that impede social progress, rather than attacking problems head on. It's an action-oriented society, but those actions often incorporate principles of long-term thinking. You can't fix the problem unless you fix the system that created it. And in their more than 250-year history, maybe they've learned some lessons that will be useful to Long Now Boston. Anton, welcome. How are you tonight?
I'm great. Thanks very much, George, for having me.
So it's a little bit late for you, right?
Yeah, just a little bit. If you see me yawning, it's not through boredom or anything. It's just through sheer lateness.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing this. It's we really appreciate it. You know, we can hold our dinner a little bit just to hear your comments.
My pleasure.
So you're a historian, and so I'm interested in particularly this history of innovation. What drove you brought you to that topic, and what do you see in it?
Originally, I was interested in the causes of prosperity. So I was interested in causes of economic growth or changes in living standards over the very long term. My main interest, and this is now the subject of my second book, which I'm still writing, and was the subject of my PhD, was all about the causes of the Industrial Revolution. So actually, originally, the way I got into writing about the RSA was that I was looking at the sorts of institutions that inventors had been setting up during that period. So, you know, from the 17th century right through to the 19th century. And it was one of the ones that really stood out because it gave prizes for non-patented inventions. And so there's a nice source of data there in terms of just trying to work out what inventors were doing, because you know, there's a whole bunch of names that don't appear in the patent lists, but did appear in the prize lists. And so just in terms of just finding out about inventors at the time and what drove them, and then also, you know, what kinds of things that they were doing, kinds of things that they were changing. The RSA became at first a kind of bit of source material. And then eventually, the people there heard about what I'd been researching, and they happened to be looking for someone to write a new history of it. And so they asked me to.
Well, there you go. That's interesting. So how would you describe the RSA today in like 25 words or less? I mean,
that's a very difficult question. So I think the main thing for most people to bear in mind here is the RSA is unique. It doesn't fit into any pigeonhole. It's not like I can just say, oh, it's a think tank, or it's a business, or it's a non-profit. Like, it doesn't actually have a type because it is a type of its own. Or rather, it's a type that was copied for a few decades, you know, in other countries, but again, it didn't really take off. It seems to be the only one of its kind still. The best description, I realize I'm going over 25 words already, is that it's a subscription-funded, membership-based, semi-official national improvement agency. And when you say, well, improving what? Anything and everything, right? The name Arts, Manufactures and Commerce essentially covers absolutely everything, at least in terms of absolutely everything that humans do. So maybe it's not about the study of nature. You already had organizations like the Royal Society that already did that. But in terms of what it is that humans do, arts, the arts of man, you know, this kind of old phrase, manufactures, commerce, that kind of covers all of the rest. And at the time, they had all sorts of debates about whether or not they should stick literary in there or various other words into the title, but it doesn't really matter. So that's I think the kind of short answer as to what exactly it is. And what it
Well, I
does
don't think
today
that
is it has to
yeah.
keep reinventing itself. It has to keep coming up with new things to improve. So if you think of it as an improvement agency, that's the common thread in terms of what it's actually done. Everything. I mean, the reason the cover has this kind of center with things branching off it is because trying to choose a single image that defines what it did is impossible. You have to have everything that it was kind of doing shown there all around it.
So I guess I've heard about the problem that organizations say about mission creep. Did the RSA, it sounds like they had some core, but a lot of different things spun off of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, at least in the way that it was originally designed, mission creep, I guess, was in some ways curtailed. So when they set up the Society of Arts, I mean, first of all, 11 blokes walk into a coffee shop, basically, in 1754, and decide to declare themselves the Society of the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. The Royal only gets added much, much, much later on. And they grow and grow and grow, and they kind of pool their subscription money, 2 guineas per person, 20 per year, 20 guineas for life. Actually quite a lot of money to the ordinary person. To mercantile and political elites, that's actually not so much. But still a significant chunk of money each. And then it was one person, one vote. So you had this direct democracy from the coffee table to ever larger arenas, if you like, people sitting in a kind of horseshoe-shaped configuration, a bit like, I guess, I'm not actually sure what the American Senate's like, but a bit like the European Parliament or some other kind of various national parliaments. And unlike Britain, where you have, this side versus that side, and it's very confrontational, they always had this kind of sitting around the table type thing that then scaled up. And so as a result of that, you do get random ideas coming in. So, someone stands up and says, hey, we should give a prize for this random thing that I'm interested in. Or, hey, we shouldn't, instead of giving prizes, we should just, I don't know, this is an actual example, give subsidies to a company that will start bringing fish to London via land instead of by sea to undercut the Billingsgate fish market monopolists. Or we should start giving subsidies to people to grow hemp for rope for ships, in addition to what the government's been subsidizing in America. So you get all sorts of random ideas, but because it's a direct democracy, because everyone has the chance to debate it, you still have to convince the rest of the members that it's a good idea. It's not like you can just have one person kind of allowing the mission to creep into whatever particular domain so that it kind of keeps going in that direction.
So they probably had some long meetings from time to time with a lot of people arguing back and forth.
Yeah, so about that fish land carriage scheme, sounds extremely random today, but I did see some newspaper reports saying that, they'd start their meetings at 6 p.m, typically on a Wednesday. Committee meetings might be on other different days, but the main meeting 6 p.m. on every Wednesday. And apparently they were there until 3 a.m. sometimes, debating whether or not this was a good idea or whether or not the guy they'd been paying the money to had absconded with the money and was fraudulent. This became a very heated thing occasionally. And you get newspaper reports saying people were very warm, meaning that they were not physically hot, but they were getting kind of heated in their discussion.
So take us back to that first meeting. So this is, you said it was William Shipley, right?
Mm-hmm.
And 10 other people in a coffee house. So the coffee house was like, it wasn't like Starbucks today. I mean, it was like a tendency for people to hang out and converse and have political and public discourse.
Yeah, so the coffee house is very different. It's not you go in, you put your headphones in, you kind of tap away at your laptop and ignore absolutely everyone. It's very much more you walk in and you hear some discussions and you join in, or you see someone reading aloud from the newspaper or the latest pamphlets. And, it's about discussion. It's the kind of mini forums, if you like, for a very rainy country, where I guess you could go inside and discuss things in much the same way as people would do in pubs and so on. In fact, by the way, they're called coffee shops, but actually a lot of the time they're serving alcohol. So there might be coffee, you might have chocolates, you have chocolate houses you hear about sometimes. Tea, for some reason, becomes much more of a female thing. So having tea would be a kind of female circle, and the male circle ended up being the coffee shop. So that, although interestingly, the Society of Arts has women as members from the very beginning, Shipley,
Well, that
the
was a
founder,
very,
says he sees
right.
no reason why we shouldn't, in effect, take women's money for the subscription fund. And they'll have the voting rights as well, but it's actually unclear that it's, one of the things I looked into was whether or not women actually attended the early meetings. As far as I can tell, they were doing things like voting by proxy, suggesting that they weren't. I suspect part of that is at the time they kind of wanted to stay separate. You had some very prominent people. Sorry, yeah.
I was just saying the social and cultural mores of the day didn't necessarily think it was proper for a woman to go to a pub and yell and scream and argue back and forth. So
raucous, I think is the raucous is the words to use there. Like that you probably would have been exposed to some bad foul language during the debates. So you do get some quite famous people though. People like Elizabeth Montagu, who's the founder of the Blue Stocking movement. Women being patrons of the arts, especially for other women, for writers, for poets, for artists. She's a member for about 50 years. But again, I couldn't find any, she's a member. She obviously had a say. She seems to have voted on certain things. It's unclear whether or not she was actively involved. And certainly in the 1810s, 1807 roughly, there starts to be a big push to actually get women directly involved in the meetings. So maybe something had changed in the culture at the time.
And that sense of sort of a very radical egalitarian thrust, that goes way back to the beginning of the RSA, right? It's been continuous for the 250 years. So that seems a little bit remarkable.
Yeah, I think there's something about a lot of British institutions at the time that like that. So the coffee house itself is sort of like that. It's quite expensive to go to a coffee house. You'd often pay for entry, a bit like coming into a club, and then you get the drinks and so on for free. Maybe you'd then pay extra for food. But once you paid, there was a kind of equality between people. And I think it's a very similar culture. It's the sort of place where you could maybe sit next to a duke, even though you're a tradesman or a merchant of some kind. And so it's squishing the hierarchy there, especially towards the top. So you didn't have to be born into privilege to be able to hang out with these people in a day-to-day. And people did segment. They go to different coffee houses. There was one coffee house where you had to speak Latin, another coffee house that might be where all the kind of French refugees went, another coffee house that maybe was associated with Catholics, another coffee house that maybe would have, a lot of the scientists or the writers or the poets. And people would do tours. You'd go around and spend most of your afternoon, if you're some kind of gentleman, going, say, oh, let's spend a bit of time at the chess one and go to a slightly different one for different sorts of discussion. You hear people talking about going on a tour of these, a bit like doing a pub crawl in some ways, but for coffee houses.
Yeah,
so
and that coffee house, I was interested in that particular coffee house where they had that meeting is still in existence today, right? Well, the name.
No, not quite. The name has survived.
The name is
Rothmell's Coffee House. So within the RSA building, so they've been in that building since 1774, so 20 years after they were founded. Before then, they'd moved from coffee house to coffee house, people's houses, different buildings. They got larger and larger, and you need to accommodate more members. And now they've opened a new coffee house in the basement of that building, which is they're trying to recreate the original way they had been doing it. I must say, having been there certainly before lockdown, now it's completely empty, right? Obviously, but before lockdown, it was buzzing with conversation. Whereas before, you'd had a sort of smaller coffee house and then a library, and people weren't talking. Now they've merged the two. So you can't sit quietly on your own, at least not quietly. Maybe you can stick headphones in, but it's otherwise a buzz.
Yeah. So let's go back to William Shipley. I want to ask you, what was driving him? What was he interested in getting out of this organization?
That's a good question. So Shipley is a kind of a peripheral character in many ways, and yet the founder of the Society of Arts. So he's peripheral to the Republic of Letters. He's a sort of amateur collector, amateur scientist. He talks to the famous scientists and, writes them letters telling them about small discoveries he's made or kind of observations he's made. But he's really a kind of gentleman's younger son who's allowed to go off and study art, and then kind of go around doing landscape paintings at various gentlemen's houses and so on. So his brother is a bishop. That's obviously the brother who has all the success and the family pins their hopes on. Jonathan Shipley, who's actually Benjamin Franklin's host when he comes to England, writes, I think is his memoirs there. At least starts them there. But yeah, so William Shipley is a kind of interesting character. But at one point he goes to Northampton, and he's a bit of an inventor himself, but he sees problems in society as a whole. You've got problems, for example, with merchants, he thinks, who are forestalling the market or engrossing the market, monopolists, people who are buying up stuff when it's cheap and then selling it when it's more expensive and kind of screwing over the poor.
Right, and that included coal, right?
Fuel.
Yeah, the fuel
So
and coal.
fuel, yeah, so wood and charcoal, coal potentially as well.
Yeah.
And so he sets up a subscription fund. He thinks, we can try and do something about this. And he has a bit of a trial run, in a way, of the Society of Arts, but for a much more specific aim. But the other thing he notices in Northampton is horse fairs, which sounds extremely random. But there's a huge fair where people are buying and selling horses. And he is simply amazed at the amount of investment that's going into horses just for horse racing. You've got horses being imported from North Africa. In the 1750s, that's a big deal. You've got all sorts of horse breeding going on, trying to get. How on earth has this huge industry arisen? And he's told that it's to do with prizes. So this idea of using prizes as the kind of modus operandi of the Society of Arts is because he thinks, okay, well, barely any money is spent on these honorary medals, the silver plate that you might get for winning a race. And there's honor involved there, but actually the amount of cash you're getting there is extremely small, but the amount of cash that's spent to win the prize can be huge. So it's out of all proportion to it, in a way. And so that's the idea he has. He kind of combines the horse fairs with this idea of a subscription fund and this moderate success that he sees with essentially buying up fuel when it is cheap and then selling it at cost price during the winter to undercut monopolists. And then goes to London with this plan and tries to get people to sign up to it.
And so that concept of putting out a prize with maybe some nominal value to it or significant value to it, but you're saying that he saw that would generate an incredible amount of innovation, often requiring much more investment than the actual prize itself. Right. So it was a way of leveraging creativity and innovation and bringing it to bear on a specific problem.
Exactly, and also leveraging people's self-interest for the public good. So he sees it as a way of, nearly all of the problems with society are seen to be individuals versus the Commonwealth. Individuals versus, and I mean the Commonwealth not in terms of the parliamentarian regime that's set up in the English Civil War. I mean this idea of the Commonwealth, that society as a whole, right? The public good. And it's almost at every level, it seems to be about selfishness versus the Commonwealth. So for aristocrats, there's this problem where they seem to be ignoring their estates in the country and just frittering their money away in London. For the middle classes, they're worried about monopolists. For the lower classes, they think that they're just copying the kind of selfish ways of the upper classes and the middle classes. And so he sees this as a way to essentially tap into that selfishness, but actually redirect it towards much broader ends.
So that, that issue of providing rewards and incentives requires money. So where do you get the money from for that?
Right, and this I think is where the genius of Shipley shines through. He realizes that he can exploit people's hope that they'll be seen to be public spirited. So he kind of, through another avenue, realizes that he can exploit people's self-interest to create this fund in the first place. So for example, you have a subscription list for people who become patrons of the Society of Arts, who become members. And that's actually one of the most important documents that we have. It's the list of members, because it's not just a private list. It's not like you kind of donate a bit and that's that. No, 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 no. This is a public list where it's ordered not alphabetically, well, it's sort of alphabetically, but under A, it's going to start out with the Duke of whatever, and then the earls, and then the counts, and then the esquires, and then the ordinary people. And then you go to B, and it's the Duke of Beaufort and Bedford, and then the earls and counts and so on. So you can see how you're placed next to these other people. And so it's about he creates a public list basically of public spirited people. And obviously everyone wants to be seen to be public spirited. So that's one of the ways he uses there. And then the other thing that happens is that by getting all of these people signed up, and publicly so, as patrons of the nation, if you like, patrons of the public good, is that then other people also have their interests there. That you get famous tradesmen of the time, people like Thomas Chippendale, famous for his furniture, realizing that, oh, there's actually a lot of famous people who are going to this society and debating all sorts of issues, many of them potential clients. And so you get other people realizing that they can maybe make some money out of it as well. But for Shipley, this doesn't matter, right? The whole point is that at least they're doing things for the public good. Although he's exploiting people's selfishness in these ways, he doesn't need altruism to make it work, but he can have altruistic ends out of the exploiting selfish means.
Yeah, so and that principle of rewarding or incentivizing was both upwards in terms of, you can get some social status if you subscribe and belong, and then also in the design competitions where the prizes and premiums, where he's incentivizing people to be creative because they want to win a prize. So that issue of kind of doing good by fixing these incentives seems to be a key part of the DNA of the RSA. And you already talked about this kind of the radical egalitarianism in terms of, everybody's equal, everybody has a vote, and it admitted women, ages before other organizations admitted women. The other piece is you haven't talked about yet is where does art and design fit into both Shipley's imagination as well as the time, and because that seems to be an important piece of the RSA story.
Yeah, I mean, people often, you hear Royal Society of Arts, or you hear Society of Arts, which I think is the more usual one, at least for its history. And people think, okay, art. And yes, art is included, but it's not the be all and end all. But it is an important part of the strand. After all, Shipley was himself a drawing master, drawing teacher, has his own drawing school. He's a painter himself. The way it fits in those, I mean, basically there's lots of different projects, and it's difficult sometimes to actually work out as a historian exactly what's going on, but you can often infer it from the sorts of arguments that are used. So at the very first meeting, you have prizes for cobalt, finding a cobalt mine, sort of blue ore, growing madder, which is used for a red dye, and also drawing prizes for young people. And all three of those are related to art, right? Blue, red, and drawing prizes for young people. But at the same time, they're related to the national economy, right? One of the big worries at the time is that, again, selfish people. Selfish people are importing too much. They're getting too French in their fashions. Ugh. They're getting elaborate lace and very richly colored embroidered tunics or whatever, right? Or waistcoats. They're adopting the fashions of France. And as a result of that, their money is going abroad to pay for these imports, right? So you have what's now called, I mean, at the time this term doesn't exist, the kind of mercantilist framework. They're extremely concerned about money going abroad, money going overseas. And so partly it's kind of about industrial policy. It's about trying to find British sources of these items so they don't need to be imported. Cobalt at the time was basically only imported from Austria. Madder was mostly imported from the Dutch. And so if they could grow these things, or at least have British competition from these things, they can make sure that these foreign suppliers aren't going to price gouge them as a nation. So they're often concerned about that. And then also, part of the artistic prizes, the artists realize very quickly, by the way, this is an interesting element, is that when you have an open, a direct democracy like this, certain factions decide that they might want to take over. So artists, having become involved in judging the drawing prizes, and we're talking people like Joshua Reynolds, William Hogarth, the really big names, they decide that this could potentially be what a Royal Academy along the French lines. And so they start pushing for more and more art-related prizes in the mid-1750s and early 1760s, to the extent that some other members start complaining about this, saying, I thought, I got into this to fund other things like growing plants in North Carolina or something. I don't want to be funding all of these art prizes all the time. What on earth is going on? But they realized basically through entryism, they tried to take over the organization. They set up exhibitions. So the Royal Academy's annual exhibitions, which have been going on since 1768, actually the Royal Academy is a splinter group of a splinter group from the artists who tried to take over the Society of Arts. And when they weren't successful, they split off. But the first exhibitions are in 1760 to try and create a demand for more artists. They're trying to create new markets there. And again, that comes into national competition. It's a very much an economic thing. Shipley has this idea that we need to teach young people to draw, we need to teach them basic design skills, and then our design will improve and Britain will be able to compete with France when it comes to exporting textile designs.
So in a sense of this interrelatedness of these features. So you picking at one thing in terms of art, getting the blue from the cobalt, because it's really coming from France, or I guess that one was coming from somewhere else. But that then becomes threads into industrial interests and the national economy and the public good, or the national good as a whole. So it's this interrelated connections. And
right.
It and also sounds, go ahead.
Yeah, so the artists, when they get in, people like Reynolds, they're arguing, Shipley got this wrong. The only way to have better design is if you give us high artists, the portrait painters and the history painters and the architects and the sculptors, the real high art type stuff. And there's a very rigid hierarchy, by the way, according to art theory at the time, left over from the Renaissance. If you give it to the high art, there's a sort of trickle-down effect to design. So if we gave loads and loads of money to these high artists and encourage that, then they'll be truly original. They'll be insulated from the market if we can have a Royal Academy, if we can have exhibitions, if we're not always just giving money, if it's not just all about private patrons, if there was this other source of income, then we'd have this trickle-down effect and be able to compete with France with true originality. But what's interesting there, of course, is extremely self-interested, but clearly to get access to the fund, they needed to convince other people that there was this economic justification for what they're doing, something that's much more appealing to the common good.
The other aspect of this interrelatedness that comes out in the book is, the RSA is in this incredibly complex ecosystems of societies and associations and many spin-offs, many things kind of merge for a while and then spin off. And so that seems, is that an important part of it? There was a lot of energy floating around, energy coming out of the Enlightenment, wanting to do good, wanting to make things better, and optimism about technology floating around, and all of these various initiatives in all of these different fields, plus the sciences, feeding into this, generated this energy. And the RSA was able to spin some of it, and other organizations were around. So there was this ecosystem of organizations that were sometimes competing and sometimes cooperating.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the Society of Arts is there are a few similar initiatives in some ways, but they just beforehand. So in the 1720s, you almost get what's like a private company version, where it'd be a for-profit. But unfortunately for that project, it happens at around the same time as the South Sea bubble and then crash. In fact, it's one of the people who's involved with the French version of that, a guy called Henry Sully, clockmaker, who's involved with the John Law scheme, the Mississippi Company. The problem is he's a projector, and he doesn't have the reputation that someone like Shipley, who's completely disinterested in, Shipley has no control over the organization he creates because it's one person, one vote. Whereas someone like Sully, you know that he would have tried to make some profit out of the thing. Similarly, there's another group called the Anti-Gallican Association, so as in anti-French association, where they're also worried about imports of these luxury items, but their response isn't to have prizes, isn't to try and take advantage of this and create British manufacturers in place of the French ones. Their response is to basically be a supper club for people to very publicly not wear French things and not drink French wine and drink English ale and beer and things like that instead. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of there's definitely a lot of energy going into it. But the interesting thing about the Society of Arts is that for a good while, it's the only show in town in terms of doing what it's doing. It's the only one that gets off the ground in the 1750s and 60s. It has basically everyone who's anyone involved in London as a member, to the extent that it gets about 2,000 members in the 1760s, although it then trails off because you get a few scandals like that fish thing. You get people lose interest because they're tired of just turning up and debating who gets what prize. And then you also get spin-offs. So artists are a spin-off, a very early one. They decide that they should have their own dedicated thing. Eventually they set up the Royal Academy. Later on, you've got the Chemical Society of London. You've got the Board of Agriculture and various other agricultural societies. You get a few local versions of the Society of Arts. So there's one in Bristol in the West Country. There's briefly one in Scotland. I think what happens is that over time, weirdly, this Society of Arts is kind of a victim of its own success, because by being the mother of societies in many ways, it has all these spin-offs that then compete with its members for their attention, for their time. And I think that's one of the interesting things today is, for an organization that's persisted for well over 250 years, that it's still managed to keep going, keep doing things, even though it itself has been the cause of that proliferation of various other societies kind of chewing off bits of its modus operandi.
And that takes you into the 19th century, I think, with I guess the society went down a little bit, and then Henry Cole comes along, and it sounds like there was a new period of revitalization in the mid-1800s. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So this is, I think, the first big reinvention, is that for about 100 years, it is a premium giving society, a prize giving society, honorary medals, cash prizes, direct democracy. And then in the 1830s, membership is seriously in decline to the extent that the organization nearly dies. There aren't enough new members. The old members aren't paying their dues. Even when you have members, they're not turning up to meetings. Just people are tired of committee work. There are too many other societies that are much more interesting to go to, where they've got, some fancy lecture, a bit of infotainment that you can enjoy, versus sitting on a committee and trying to work out who deserves what bit of your ever decreasing fund. And they decide to reinvent themselves. So first of all, it becomes a representative democracy. They decide that a lot of the committee work should be given to a small board of very committed members, and that they should instead try to attract their normal members through other things. They'll still pay their dues as members. In fact, they still do right to the present. About half of the income of the RSA still comes from membership dues. And so they've got the representative democracy. They give lectures and various other ways of drawing in the normal society members. One of the things they do is they realize you've got all these specialist societies. You've got chemical ones, agricultural ones, various blah, blah, blah. What they can do is they can be the place where people come to look at the intersection of those new fields. So become a kind of boundary crossing society in some ways. So you've got chemistry, you've got art, photography. You've got agriculture, you've got chemistry, the first chemical fertilizers. You've got the new fields like electricity. You've got new fields like aeronautics. Nearly all of them have their early meetings or are spin-offs from that period as a result of them trying to combine things, trying to cross those different fields. Interestingly, actually, something that I kind of think there could be societies like that today that should be continuing that kind of work, given specialization has only increased since the 1840s. So they were already worrying about the sort of thing that we worry about now, that people are now too specialized, all the way back, that's That's a very long, sorry, almost 200 years ago, right? So,
yeah. And that period of foment and the leadership of Henry Cole then led to the idea of exhibits, exhibitions, expositions, and the Great Expedition of 1851.
yeah, so exhibitions are a really neat way of doing what prizes do, but in a kind of in a new fashion, in a much more attention-grabbing way. People, I guess, have gone a bit tired of prizes. And actually, the patent system gets better as well. Partly simply not because of any reform to the patent system, but because what had before been a situation where you would patent something and the specification would be hidden away in some legal library, basically, where it'd be very difficult for you to access it. With the rise of more and more print publications, so newspapers and periodicals and magazines printing the specifications, suddenly patents actually become less of a monopoly and more of a way of spreading innovation. And so they think a lot of the members by that stage are engineers who use the patent system all the time, and they don't have that kind of animosity towards it that some of the early members of the society had, right? It was for non-patent inventions that they were giving these prizes because they wanted to complement that system. So exhibitions are a new way around that. They notice what France is doing. They notice what France is doing. So the French, since the 1790s and throughout the early 1800s, they had been, as a way to catch up with industrializing Britain, having national exhibitions of industry. So you've got the manufacturers in Marseille, those in Lyon, those in Paris, those in Nantes, wherever. They would then send every few years all of their best wares, all of their best machines and what have you, to Paris to be exhibited all in one place. And what that does is it means that the manufacturers in one part of the country can look at what manufacturers in another part of the country are doing and say, okay, well, we're behind in this respect and ahead in this respect, and here's what we can do to catch up. So it becomes a way of generating innovation through direct comparison in the same room. And at the same time, encouraging consumers, educating consumers. So if you're someone attending this exhibition, you might say, okay, well, here's the stuff that I buy from my local Paris shops all the time. Oh, wow, this is the stuff that they can buy in Marseille. Why don't we have that? Why don't we import it from that place? Or why don't we get our domestic manufacturers to produce exactly the same stuff? Right? People don't know what they want until you expose them to those things. And so exhibitions become this neat way of doing everything in the same place. And people like Henry Cole, this is remarkable reformer. He's not the first to come up with these ideas, but he is one of the people who really makes it work. Is that the society have been experimenting with exhibitions. He's the one that really takes that up and says, okay, we need to make this the thing that the society now does. And that results in the first international exhibition. Basically, the French have been talking about this for a little while, but they have the 1848 revolutions, and so they say, let's do it a bit later. And so the English decide that, or Henry Cole and others decide that this is their chance to be the first of the first international exhibition, and hence the Great Exhibition at Crystal Palace. So 6 million people within just a few months attend this thing. Absolutely huge number of people, exhibits from all over the world. You've got celebrity exhibits like the Koh-i-Noor, the great fat big diamond. You've got, which actually people thought looked like glass. They were very unimpressed by it. You've got all sorts of things from India, which are especially impressive to people. They're shocked at how amazing some of the design is, because I think they just had completely different assumptions. They're amazed by the stuff that's coming from America in terms of machinery and design, in terms of what's coming from France and Germany and so on. It becomes a really interesting way of generating what they wanted there. But at the same time, Cole is a utilitarian. Cole was friends with John Stuart Mill, so Bentham's disciple. And one way of characterizing what Cole cares about is utilitarianism applied. He's not really a philosopher, he's not really a thinker, but he's a doer. He really gets things done. So the Great Exhibition is one of these big things. But the other thing he realizes is that through the exhibition, he can get the sorts of utilitarian reforms that he wants Britain to have. An education system, much more state involvement in the education system, for example. He cares particularly deeply about things like design. You mentioned that he was involved before he's involved with the Society of Arts, but he's involved with the penny postage He's Roland Hill's main assistant, and he's kind of the PR guy who manages to really get this thing to have popular appeal. He's very in touch with the free trade movement. One of the interesting things here is that, you know, it's an exhibition of the industry of all nations, right? It's not just a world fair like they kind of became in the 20th century, where sort of national branding exercises. At the time, it's very much about the industry itself and comparison of industry. And to the free traders, that's also an excuse to show off what it is that the working classes and the manufacturing classes are doing versus these lazy aristocrats who are apparently doing very little, or are doing things like putting up tariffs on the corn that feeds those classes.
This is
so
an incredible,
into a lot of it.
Yeah, this is an incredible story, again, about the interrelatedness of all these different features. It must have been a heck of a thing to try and pull that together and make sense of it all, which you do really well in the book.
Thanks.
But in the interest of time, I kind of want to pull us forward now. I know the RSA has been going through a new period of renewal. I guess there was a loss of a major source of income, so they're having to reinvent themselves now. And what's the key? Matthew Taylor, I guess, is the fellow that's leading the organization now. And what's the key thing that he's trying to bring the RSA forward in after its more recent dip in?
Yeah, well, I guess I should explain the dip, right? So off the high of the Great Exhibition, the Society gets involved with all sorts of reforms. It reforms the patent system, the copyright system, the first photographic copyright is as a result of the Society of Arts lobbying. It sets up the first public toilet trials, unsuccessful, sadly, off the back of the Great Exhibition. It also, through the Great Exhibition, by bringing all these people from all over the world together, you know, they try to set up the first of the kind of international postal unions, and then telegraph unions, and all these other kind of international standardization efforts come out of these early world fairs as well, because they're excuses for everyone to meet in the same place. In fact, I actually learned after I wrote the book that the first international chess tournament was held to coincide with the Great Exhibition, because they knew that all the smart people would be there from all over the world, or at least many of them would, and so they would all have an excuse to go to the same thing.
And wasn't limited liability reform also came out of that?
Limited liability reform.
That's now the heart of capitalism, is the limited liability reform. So it came right out of that.
Yeah, so most people assume that limited liability is ancient, but actually you either needed a royal charter or an act of parliament from the 1720s right through to the 1850s in order to be a limited liability company. So generalizing limited liability was what they did then. And interestingly, a lot of people think, oh, this must be some kind of just very boring reform. Actually, it's all to do with strikes. It's all to do with labor strife. People thought it would be a way to reconcile capital with labor, because you would allow workers to become shareholders at the same time. Whereas before, you would have to be extremely rich to invest in an unlimited liability company. You know, if it goes bust, you can go bust too, right? You will be liable for the debts of the company at the same time. And so this was their chance to reward workers with stock options, basically, or for people to just invest in companies in general, and then kind of be capitalists even while they're at the same time workers. And for the workers, it's a great deal. It was extremely popular because it gave them the chance to look at the account books and tell whether or not they actually did need to go on strike or not. So there's a kind of a bonus, a win-win-win sort of situation.
Let's jump ahead, because another reform was the examination systems that came out of that. And then that became, it sounds like, a key moneymaker for the RSA until that was dispensed with in what, the 1990s, 2000?
1980s. So what happens is that in the 1850s, one of the ways in which they highlight the way Britain is falling behind from the Great Exhibition is through mass education, particularly science and design. And so they set up examinations as a way to try and do this. Originally, it's a union of mechanics institutions, and I won't even go into that because that's a whole other thing. But basically, self-educating workers would pay for lecturers to, all over the country, would pay for lecturers to kind of teach themselves after work. So Birkbeck University actually is originally the London Mechanics Institution. They still give evening classes in that ancient tradition. But they're in decline by the 1850s. The society is asked, can they perhaps do something about this and try and help? So they become the center for a union of mechanics institutions. And actually the Journal of the Society of Arts, which continues to this day, is originally the journal of the RSA and the institutions in union, right? So it was about the journal of this new movement for mass education. And they realized one of the ways to reform these institutions that they're in decline is to give people an incentive to educate themselves. And so examinations becomes the way that they do that. And so what they do is they sort of work with the government. So Henry Cole, I mentioned earlier, is a civil servant. He gets, off the back of the success of the Great Exhibition, he gets his own department, the Department of Science and Art. And so with his two hats as a vice president of the Society of Arts and this head of this new department, he basically uses the Society of Arts to, for example, offer examinations in one subject. Once it's a success, the government will then take that on. Then he'll try another subject. If that's a success, again, the government will take that on. And at the same time, it's a way for them to build the state education system, because the problem at the time was that the government couldn't get involved with schools directly because they were controlled by religious organizations. So if the government were to control schools, okay, well, what religion are they going to teach in the schools? It can't be nothing. It can't be Anglicanism. That's the established church, but then all the dissenters say, oh my God, no. And if you teach any other kind of religion, then the Anglicans say, well, that's not the established religion. We can't teach that either. And so what they do instead is they pay teachers by the results of the examinations. So you get teaching to the test, payment by results, so that teachers can teach the things that the government wants to teach, and they'll get paid for that. Excuse me. But at the same time, the schools will still have control over the basic functions of what they're doing. And they eventually apply that to things like reading, writing, arithmetic in schools, as well as to the more adult education institutions like the mechanics institutions. Now, the problem is, this is a huge success, but it actually usually the RSA, I think, worked best when it had a project, and then when it was a success, it passed it on. It became a separate thing. What happens in the 1880s is the Society of Arts continues to hold these examinations, and it does so for well over 100 years, right up to the 1980s. The problem there is that by the 1980s, the RSA's entire operating surplus, 3/4 of its staff, 3/4 of its revenue are actually from the exams and not from its other activities. So this is the period, also interestingly, where membership numbers don't seem to matter so much. The members themselves start to petition for the society to become royal, to use that name. They also change from members or subscribers to fellows, because they look at the old Royal Society and they look at a lot of the other spin-offs and they say, you know, we're actually much more ancient than these spin-offs. Why don't we call ourselves fellows? It sounds much more exclusive and fancy. And so in the early 20th century, the society gains this perception of being like a learned society or like a club of some sort, when actually nothing could be further from the truth, right? It's still very much a membership subscription scheme where they use that fund for various projects for the public good. And those, you do get some projects in this period, 1880s to 1980s, some really interesting ones, like when they buy the entire village of West Wickham as part of a campaign to preserve the ancient medieval and Tudor cottages that are being torn down because of new sanitation laws or because of roads being widened. In the 1960s, they're even involved with the birth of the environmentalist movement as we know it. Before you've got organizations like Greenpeace and the Green Party and so on, at least in the UK. And yet at the same time, membership numbers continue to just increase because that royal cachet means that people just become members for the title. They become members for putting FRSA after their names, as though it denotes that they've been inducted to this kind of exclusive club. But what that means is that I think this is a period of decline, or a period of problems at least, because the society doesn't have its feet to the fire, right? In the past, if it was doing things, it got more members. If it wasn't doing things, it lost those members and it was forced to change and do new things. From the 1900s onwards, membership just increases regardless of what they're doing. And so it's allowed to become complacent.
Right. The organization becomes, has an easy source of money, and then it becomes entrenched, and it gets stale, and it loses its original focus.
Yeah,
And then
so
it goes
two bits there. Easy source of alternative income relative to membership, and then the royal aspect, which means that it gets more members anyway. So what's happened is that in the 1980s, they decided to split off the exam board, right? So they lost 3/4 of their staff, 3/4 of their revenue, their entire operating surplus, an extremely brave thing to do. And I would argue probably one of the best things it's done in the past century, right? So, you know, shockingly, like, financially imprudent decision, and yet I think a really, really good decision in terms of the society's actual kind of core aims, because immediately you start seeing this search for new projects.